The morning sun cast long shadows across Meadowbrook Estates as Marcus Williams stepped out of his midnight blue F-150, the truck's chrome gleaming like a beacon in the pristine suburban landscape. He stretched his arms, feeling the satisfying crack of his joints after the 12-hour shift at the construction site downtown. All he wanted was to grab a shower, maybe catch a few hours of sleep before his evening classes at the community college. But as his work boots hit the manicured pavement, Marcus felt it, that familiar weight of eyes upon him. The kind of scrutiny that had followed him his entire life, intensifying whenever he dared to exist in spaces where his presence was questioned. From across the street, Margaret Whitmore stood like a sentry behind her perfectly trimmed hedge, her pale blue eyes narrowing as they swept over his mud-splattered truck. At 62, Margaret had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of Meadowbrook's standards, a position she wore like armor. Her lips pursed into a thin line as she noted every detail: the construction equipment in the truck bed, the slight oil stain beneath the vehicle, the way Marcus's work clothes contrasted sharply with the neighborhood's sterile perfection. This was his third week living in his late grandmother's house, the house where he'd spent countless summers learning about strength, dignity, and the power of quiet resilience. Grandma Rose had been the neighborhood's beloved matriarch, the woman who baked cookies for new residents and organized holiday decorations. But now she was gone, and her house belonged to Marcus, a 25-year-old black man whose very existence seemed to disturb the delicate ecosystem Margaret had worked so hard to preserve. As Marcus fumbled for his house keys, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders, he didn't notice Margaret marching across the street with purpose. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Years of experience had taught him the delicate art of de-escalation, though every fiber of his being bristled at the injustice. Margaret's eyes swept over him with undisguised disdain. "This is a residential neighborhood, young man. We have rules here. No commercial vehicles, no construction equipment, and certainly no—" She gestured vaguely at his appearance, her meaning crystal clear, without her having to say the words that danced on the tip of her tongue. "This is my truck, and this is my house," Marcus replied, his voice steady, despite the anger building in his chest. He pointed to the modest, two-story home behind him, the one with the faded rose bushes his grandmother had tended with such love. "I live here." But Margaret was already shaking her head, her perfectly styled silver hair catching the light as she moved. "I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. This is Meadowbrook Estates. We have a homeowners association, we have standards, and we have ways of dealing with people who refuse to comply." The threat hung in the air like morning fog, heavy and suffocating. Marcus felt something inside him crack, not break, but crack like the first fissure in a dam that's been holding back years of accumulated pressure. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice now. "This was my grandmother's house. Rose Williams, maybe you remember her?" For just a moment Margaret's mask slipped. Yes, she remembered Rose, sweet Rose, who had welcomed her to the neighborhood 15 years ago with fresh-baked bread and genuine warmth. But the moment of recognition passed quickly, replaced by stubborn determination. "That changes nothing," Margaret snapped, pulling out her phone with theatrical flourish. "I'm calling the towing company. That truck will be gone within the hour, and if you have a problem with it, you can take it up with the HOA board." As she dialed, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency, Marcus stood frozen in disbelief. He watched this woman, this stranger who knew nothing about his life, his struggles, his dreams, casually attempting to destroy his morning, his peace, his right to exist in the space his grandmother had left him. But what Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined as she waited for the towing company to answer her call, was that some battles choose their own warriors. And sometimes, those warriors have connections that run deeper than suburban prejudice could ever reach. 20 minutes later, Marcus sat on his front porch steps, watching Margaret pace back and forth like a caged animal, her phone pressed against her ear with increasing agitation. The towing company was on their way, she'd announced triumphantly, but her victory felt hollow as the minutes ticked by without any sign of a tow truck. "What do you mean you can't find the address?" she barked into the phone, her voice rising to a pitch that made several neighbors peek through their curtains. "It's Meadowbrook Estates. How difficult can it be?" Marcus almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he remembered the look in her eyes, the casual cruelty with which she had dismissed his rights, his grandmother's memory, his very humanity. The sympathy evaporated like morning dew. From his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text message. His father, as always, checking in after Marcus's overnight construction shift. "How's the new place treating you, son? Getting some rest?" Marcus stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could he explain this situation to his father without sounding like he was asking for help? How could he convey the frustration of being 25 years old and still having to prove his right to exist in spaces where others took their presence for granted? Sheriff David Williams had raised his son to be independent, to fight his own battles with dignity and strength, but he'd also raised him to know when those battles were bigger than any one person could handle alone. Marcus had inherited his father's sense of justice, but also his grandmother's patience, a combination that made him powerful in ways that Margaret couldn't begin to understand. "Having a neighbor situation," Marcus typed back. "Nothing I can't handle." The response came almost immediately. "You sure? Your old man's got some experience with difficult people." Marcus smiled pied himself. His father's dry humor had gotten them through countless challenges over the years. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that made Marcus want to handle it himself, to prove that he could navigate this world without always needing his father's badge to smooth the way. Meanwhile, Margaret had moved on to her second phone call, this one to the Meadowbrook HOA president, Janet Chen. Even from 30 feet away, Marcus could hear the conversation escalating. "Janet, we have a situation," Margaret's voice carried across the morning air. "There's a man in Rose Williams's old house. Yes, I know she passed, but this is obviously some kind of arrangement. He's got a construction truck parked right in the driveway, and he's being completely uncooperative about our regulations." Marcus stood up, his patience finally fraying. He walked to the edge of his property, close enough to make his presence known, but not close enough to be accused of intimidation. Margaret's eyes darted toward him nervously as she continued her phone conversation. "I don't care what his relationship to Rose was," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a whisper. "The rules apply to everyone. If we make exceptions now, what's next? Food trucks? Commercial vehicles? The property values will plummet." It was then that Marcus understood the real battle lines. This wasn't just about his truck or even about him specifically. This was about Margaret's vision of what the neighborhood should be, a vision that apparently didn't include young black men with calloused hands and honest work. This was about control, about maintaining a certain aesthetic that valued appearance over substance, exclusion over inclusion. A new voice entered the conversation from Margaret's phone, calm, measured, but firm. Janet Chen had been the HOA president for 3 years, and while she took the rules seriously, she also understood the importance of fairness and due process. "Margaret, slow down!" Janet's voice was audible, even through the phone speaker. "You're saying this young man is living in Rose's house? Do we have any documentation about the ownership transfer? Any HOA violations that have been officially filed?" "The truck is violation enough," Margaret snapped. "Section 4.2 clearly states—" "Section 4.2 has provisions for residents who need work vehicles," Janet interrupted. "Have you actually spoken to him about compliance options? Has he been given official notice? Have you even confirmed that he's actually violating any rules, or are you making assumptions?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Marcus watched as Margaret's face flushed red with indignation. She wasn't used to having her authority questioned, especially not by someone asking for actual facts instead of emotional reactions. "I don't need to confirm anything," Margaret shot back. "I know trouble when I see it, and this is definitely trouble. If you won't support me on this, I'll handle it myself." The line went dead, and Margaret stood staring at her phone as if it had betrayed her. The towing company still hadn't arrived. The HOA president had essentially told her to follow proper procedures, and Marcus was still standing on his property, still refusing to be intimidated. For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus saw something different in Margaret's expression, not just anger or disgust, but genuine bewilderment. She had expected this to be simple: identify the problem, make a call, watch the problem disappear. The fact that the world wasn't conforming to her expectations seemed to genuinely confuse her. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the space between them with quiet authority. "Maybe we should start over. I'm Marcus Williams, Rose's grandson. I inherited this house and I'm not planning on going anywhere, but I'm also not trying to cause problems for anyone. If there are legitimate concerns about HOA rules, I'm willing to discuss them like adults." Margaret stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. The idea of negotiation, of treating him as an equal worthy of conversation rather than simply an obstacle to be removed, seemed to short-circuit her processing. "There's nothing to discuss," she said finally, but her voice had lost some of its earlier venom. "Rules are rules." "You're right," Marcus replied, surprising her. "Rules are rules. So maybe you could show me exactly which rule I'm violating, and we can figure out how to address it properly." The request was so reasonable, so perfectly logical, that Margaret found herself momentarily speechless. She had been operating on assumption and prejudice, not on actual knowledge of the HOA regulations. She had seen Marcus, seen his truck, seen his work clothes, and made a series of judgments that she had assumed would be universally supported. But now, standing in the growing heat of the morning sun, facing a young man who spoke with quiet dignity and asked only for fairness, Margaret realized that she might have started a war she wasn't prepared to fight. What she didn't realize was that some wars are won not through volume or aggression, but through patience, principle, and connections that run deeper than neighborhood politics. And Marcus Williams had connections she couldn't even imagine. By noon, Margaret's day had spiraled into a nightmare of bureaucratic frustration. The towing company had finally arrived, but after taking one look at the situation, a legally parked vehicle on private property with no official HOA violation notice, they had politely declined to proceed. The driver, a weathered man named Pete, had actually laughed when Margaret demanded they tow the truck anyway. "Lady, I can't just steal someone's truck because you don't like looking at it," Pete had said, tipping his cap to Marcus with obvious respect. "You want it towed? Get the proper paperwork. Until then, have a nice day." Margaret's second call to Janet Chen had gone even worse. The HOA president had done her homework, pulling up the actual regulations and discovering that Marcus's truck technically fell within the size and usage guidelines for resident work vehicles. Moreover, as Rose Williams's legal heir, Marcus had every right to live in the house and park his vehicle in the driveway. "Margaret, I'm going to be very clear," Janet had said, her patience obviously wearing thin. "You cannot harass residents based on your personal feelings. If you continue this behavior, you'll be the one facing HOA sanctions." But Margaret Whitmore had not spent 15 years as Meadowbrook's self-appointed guardian only to back down from a fight. If official channels wouldn't support her, she'd find other ways to make her point. The neighborhood Facebook group, for instance, where she held considerable influence as one of the founding members. Her post was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive community warfare. "Concerned neighbors, has anyone else noticed the changes in our beautiful community? Large commercial vehicles, construction equipment, and general disregard for the standards that make Meadowbrook special. I'm worried about our property values and the precedent being set. What do you think? Should we be more vigilant about protecting what we've built here?" The post garnered immediate attention. Some residents supported Margaret's concerns while others questioned the vague language and suspicious timing. But buried in the comments, a voice emerged that would change everything. "Margaret," wrote Jennifer Hayes, a newer resident who lived 3 streets over, "are you talking about Marcus Williams, Rose's grandson, the one whose father is Sheriff Williams?" The words appeared on Margaret's screen like a physical blow. She read them once, twice, 3 times, certain she must be misunderstanding something fundamental. Sheriff Williams. The name echoed in her mind as fragments of memory began clicking into place. The community barbecues where Rose had proudly talked about her son David, the police officer. The graduation photos Rose had shown around the neighborhood when David was promoted. The times Rose had mentioned her grandson Marcus, the young man she was so proud of for working construction to pay for college. With trembling fingers, Margaret opened a new browser window and typed Sheriff David Williams into the search bar. The first result was the official county website, complete with a professional photograph that made her blood run cold. The man staring back at her from the screen had Marcus's eyes, Marcus's jawline, Marcus's quiet intensity. Sheriff David Williams, 23 years of service, elected to his 3rd term just last year on a platform of community policing and equal justice. The biography was impressive. Decorated veteran, community volunteer, father of 1 son, widower who had raised his child alone after his wife's death in a car accident when Marcus was 7. But it was the recent news articles that made Margaret's hands shake as she scrolled. Sheriff Williams leads initiative on bias-based policing. Local sheriff. Community outreach program wins state award. Williams, every citizen deserves equal protection under the law. In the most recent interview just 3 months ago, Sheriff Williams had spoken about his own experiences with discrimination and his commitment to ensuring that his department treated all residents with dignity and respect, regardless of race, class, or background. "My son is a young black man in America," the sheriff had said in the interview. "Every day he faces challenges and judgments that I pray I've prepared him to handle with grace and strength. But he shouldn't have to face them alone. That's why this badge means something to me. It's not just about enforcing laws, it's about protecting the kind of community where every child can grow up feeling safe and valued." Margaret's phone slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering onto her kitchen counter. The Facebook post was still visible on her computer screen, gathering comments and reactions, becoming a permanent record of her assumptions and prejudices. But now, those same words read differently, carrying implications she hadn't considered. Across the street, Marcus was washing his truck in the driveway, the afternoon sun glinting off the chrome and casting rainbow patterns in the spray of water. He moved with unhurried efficiency, occasionally glancing up at Margaret's house as if sensing her surveillance. There was something different about his posture now, not defeated or angry, but patient in the way of someone who knows that truth has a way of revealing itself. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Carol, who lived 2 towns over but followed the Meadowbrook Facebook page religiously. "Maggie, please tell me you didn't just pick a fight with the sheriff's son. Please tell me you're not that stupid." The words hit like ice water. Margaret realized that she had committed herself to a path with no graceful exit. The Facebook post was public, her phone calls to the towing company and HOA were documented, and half the neighborhood had witnessed her confrontation with Marcus that morning. She had declared war on a young man whose only crime was existing in a space where she felt he didn't belong. But she had also declared war on the son of the most powerful law enforcement officer in the county, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his legendary protection of his family. As Margaret watched Marcus finish washing his truck and head back into his grandmother's house, she realized that her perfect suburban world was about to be turned upside down. And somewhere across town, Sheriff David Williams was probably getting a text message from his son about a neighbor situation that would require his attention. Sheriff David Williams read his son's text message for the 3rd time, his jaw tightening with each word. Marcus had finally broken down and explained the morning's events, not because he couldn't handle Margaret Whitmore, but because her Facebook post had turned a personal conflict into a community issue that threatened to escalate beyond anyone's control. "Dad, I didn't want to bring you into this, but she's trying to make it about more than just me. She's questioning whether people like us belong in neighborhoods like this. That's bigger than one person's prejudice." David sat in his office at the county sheriff's department, surrounded by commendations and community service awards, feeling the familiar weight of representation that his son carried every day. Every interaction Marcus had in the world reflected not just on himself, but on their family, their community, and the badge David wore. But this was about more than representation. This was about his child, his son, who had lost his mother too young, who had worked twice as hard as his peers to earn respect, who deserved to live in his grandmother's house without having to prove his worthiness to strangers. David picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Marcus," he said when his son answered, "I'm coming home early today. Don't engage with the neighbor anymore. Let me handle this." "Dad, I don't need you to fight my battles." "Son, this stopped being your battle the moment she made it about the community. This is about something bigger now." An hour later, David Williams pulled into the driveway of his mother's house, the house where he had grown up, where he had brought his wife as a newlywed, where his son had spent countless summers learning about family and legacy. He was wearing his uniform not because he intended to abuse his authority, but because sometimes people needed to be reminded hat actions have consequences. Margaret Whitmore was waiting for him. She had spent the afternoon in a state of panic, alternating between rage and terror as the full implications of her situation became clear. The Facebook post had backfired spectacularly. Instead of rallying support for her cause, it had exposed her motivations in a way that made several neighbors uncomfortable. Worse, word was spreading through the community about exactly who Marcus Williams was, and Margaret found herself increasingly isolated. When she saw the sheriff's patrol car pull up, her heart nearly stopped. This was it. the moment when her perfect suburban life collided with the consequences of her assumptions. David Williams stepped out of his car with the measured calm of a man who had spent decades handling volatile situations. At 52, he carried himself with quiet authority, his presence, commanding respect without demanding it. He looked across the street at Margaret, who stood frozen behind her living room window, and felt the complex mix of emotions that came with protecting his family. Marcus emerged from the house, and father and son embraced briefly, a moment of connection that spoke to years of mutual respect and love. Then David turned his attention to the situation at hand. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called across the street, his voice carrying easily in the afternoon stillness. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Margaret approached slowly, her earlier bravado replaced by the nervous energy of someone who suddenly understood the gravity of their mistakes. She had spent the day researching Sheriff Williams, and everything she had found painted a picture of a man she definitely didn't want as an enemy. "Sheriff Williams," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't realize—" "Mum," David interrupted gently but firmly, "let me be very clear about something. My son has every legal right to live in this house. He has every right to park his legally registered vehicle in that driveway, and he has every right to exist in this neighborhood without harassment, intimidation, or discrimination." Margaret's face flushed red. I never said anything about—" "It wasn't about—" "Ma'am," David continued, his voice never rising but carrying the weight of absolute authority, "I've been in law enforcement for 23 years. I've seen every type of discrimination, every excuse, every justification. I know exactly what this morning was about." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Margaret looked around desperately, hoping to see supportive neighbors, but found only curious faces watching from windows and doorways. The community she thought she spoke for was notably absent from her side. "However," David continued, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. "I'm not here as a sheriff. I'm here as a father whose son was treated with disrespect and as a man whose mother's memory was dishonored by your assumptions about who belongs in the house she left him." Marcus stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his father's arm. "Dad, it's okay. She was just scared of change. People react badly when they're scared." The grace in Marcus's words made Margaret's shame even more acute. Here was the young man she had tried to drive away, showing her more compassion than she had shown him. The contrast between her behavior and his response was stark and damaging to every assumption she had made. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus said, addressing her directly for the first time since his father's arrival, "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, but I'm also not trying to destroy yours. Maybe we could start over, get to know each other as neighbors instead of as problems to be solved." David Williams watched this exchange with pride that threatened to overwhelm him. His son, the boy he had raised to be strong, fair, and gracious, even in the face of injustice, was offering an olive branch to someone who had spent the day trying to destroy his peace. But Margaret Whitmore had learned something about consequences that day. She had learned that actions ripple outward in ways that can't always be controlled. She had learned that the sheriff's son was also a man of remarkable character, which made her own behavior look even worse by comparison. She started, then stopped, realizing that no words could undo the morning's damage. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, the words barely audible. It wasn't enough. They all knew it wasn't enough, but it was a beginning. David Williams nodded once, a gesture that carried both acknowledgement and warning. "Mrs. Whitmore, my son is a better person than I am. He's willing to give you a chance to be a better neighbor. I suggest you take it." The sheriff got back in his car and drove away, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed by the morning's revelations. 6 months later, the first annual Meadowbrook Community Garden was in full bloom, and Margaret Whitmore was on her hands and knees helping Marcus Williams plant tomatoes in a plot dedicated to his grandmother's memory. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the days following their confrontation, Margaret had endured whispered conversations and sideways glances from neighbors who had witnessed her behavior. The Facebook post had been screenshot and shared, becoming a case study in how quickly community conflicts could spiral out of control. 3 families had actually approached the HOA about removing Margaret from any leadership positions, citing her prejudicial behavior and failure to represent community values. But Marcus had surprised everyone, including himself, by speaking up on her behalf. "Everyone deserves a chance to do better," he had told Janet Chen during an emergency HOA meeting. "Mrs. Whitmore made a mistake, but condemning her forever doesn't help anyone. Maybe instead of punishment, we could find ways to bring the community together." The garden had been Marcus's idea, a way to honor his grandmother's love of growing things while creating a space where neighbors could actually get to know each other. Rose Williams had always believed that people feared what they didn't understand, and understanding required proximity, time, and shared purpose. Margaret had volunteered hesitantly, expecting rejection or mockery. Instead, she had found herself working alongside people she had only known as faces in passing cars or figures behind curtained windows. Mrs. Chen, the HOA president, turned out to be a retired teacher with fascinating stories about her students. The Johnsons from Maple Street were newlyweds who brought homemade lemonade to every work session. And Marcus was nothing like the threat she had imagined him to be. He was studying environmental science at the community college, hoping to transfer to the State University's engineering program. His construction work wasn't just a job, it was training, teaching him about building systems and structural integrity that would serve him well as an environmental engineer. His grandmother had left him the house, not just as inheritance, but as investment in his future, a stable foundation from which he could build a career helping communities develop sustainable infrastructure. "Your grandmother would have loved this," Margaret said, wiping soil from her hands as they surveyed the neat rows of vegetables and flowers. "She always talked about bringing people together." Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his face in ways that reminded Margaret of Rose's own gentle warmth. She used to say that gardens and communities were the same thing. They both need different kinds of plants to be really healthy. Too much of one thing, and everything suffers. Sheriff Williams stopped by occasionally, usually in civilian clothes, helping with the heavier work and clearly proud of what his son had created. The sight of him no longer filled Margaret with terror, though she remained respectful of both his position and her own past behavior. She had learned that authority wielded with wisdom looked nothing like the power she had tried to exercise through complaints and intimidation. The garden had attracted attention beyond Meadowbrook. The county newspaper ran a feature story about community healing through shared projects, with Marcus and Margaret photographed side by side, tending to roses that bloomed in memory of a woman who had taught them both about grace. The article never mentioned their initial conflict, focusing instead on how neighbors had come together to create something beautiful. As autumn approached and the garden's first season drew to a close, Margaret found herself changed in ways she was still discovering. The fear that had driven her behavior, fear of change, of difference, of losing control over her carefully ordered world, had been replaced by something more complex and ultimately more satisfying, genuine community connection. "Marcus," she said one evening as they packed up their tools, "I need you to know that I'm not the same person who tried to have your truck towed." He considered this seriously, as he did most things. None of us are the same people we were 6 months ago, Mrs. Whitmore. That's what growth looks like. Margaret nodded, understanding, finally, that the neighborhood she had been so desperate to preserve had actually become better, stronger, and more beautiful because of the change she had initially resisted. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, past houses where lights glowed warmly in windows and the sound of families sharing dinner drifted through screen doors, Margaret realized that Rose Williams had been right all along. The best communities aren't built on exclusion and fear, but on the radical act of making space for everyone to grow.